Thanks for your company this morning on Always Be Connecting. We are doing a webinar about called the Culture Engineers, and this is going to be a bit of a workshop for looking at ways for inclusion, especially for people who are neurodiverse. I think in the age of AI, where AI often looks at patterns, the neurodiverse people often provide the outlier or innovative solution. And I'm really thrilled to be joined by the big guns this morning. So we've got Jude Pullen from the UK. Do you want to say hello and do a little introduction for yourself, Jude?
Hello. Yes, I'm go by creative technologist and prototyping expert, which generally I sort of describe as basically an excuse to be incredibly curious about things. I tend to work with companies all the way from startups to SMEs to multinationals, looking at either how to basically explore new technology with confidence and essentially wire it up so that the rest of the business can understand and make use of it. Or alternatively, companies that have been doing the same thing for many years and were interested in giving things a more contemporary and fresh twist. So I'd say that's sort of the two ways I enjoy working, but also just really excited to join this podcast and meet a very different audience as obviously based in London, this is a really nice cultural exchange. So yeah, always be connecting, eh?
Beautiful. And just to help us with a bit of the reality of the landscape of how businesses are being inclusive, we have the wonderful Nicole Dunn from the Exceptional Academy. Nicole, can you introduce yourself?
Morning, everyone. I'm Nicole Done. I work for an organisation called Exceptional Academy. We're neurodiversity experts. I sit in a position where I love creating. My area of expertise is curriculum design, and I am producing a lot of curriculum content for our training and working with organisations on workforce planning and advisory on how to include all brain types within workplaces. I'm also very passionate. I do a lot of neurodiversity coaching and executive functioning coaching with individuals. And I love nothing more than working with leaders and helping change their perspective on how we can capitalise on the strengths of neurodivergent individuals.
Fantastic. So this is an interactive session. We really want it to be a bit of a workshop. Jude is our resident prototyper, so he's helping us explore ideas and see where we go with it. But if you have a comment, an anecdote, a story, you want to tell us that we're wrong, anything at all, pop it in the chat, pop it in the Q&A, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as we're going along the webinar. Jude, I want to start with the why. So do you want to explain a little bit of where you've seen innovation in businesses, big businesses? You've worked with Lego, Sugru. Explain a little bit about your background and the value of innovation and inclusion in your perspective.
Yeah, I think it feels like innovation often is a sort of deferred gratification for the sort of company's health, in that often, as we all know, anyone who's been around the block long enough knows that in times of economic turbulence or doubt, things like R&D and innovation are sometimes the first things to get cut because, understandably, you need to crack on and focus on sales and marketing and things like this. However, there's always that uncomfortable feeling of when things get back on terra firma, you think, okay, so what new ideas have we got? And then you're presented with what can you basically pull out of your back pocket quickly versus the companies that have invested, somewhat steadfastly, even if reduced budgets or different resources. But that thing, I feel it's essentially your lifeline to the future. So the interesting thing I feel about innovation, and I guess we're going to get into this further into the discussion, is, not just how do you innovate in terms of having a pipeline of interesting products, ideas, and markets and opportunities, but I think the reason it's so relevant to talk about neurodiversity and also, should we say, cultural diversity, is it begs the question, well, if we have a homogenous culture and capability, we're not going to see the new markets and we're not going to know how to engage with them as easily as we could or should. So those sorts of things, for me, really fascinate me. And I think even though I'm happy to talk about working at Dyson and Sugru and Lego, but strangely, I watched a sort of docudrama on the history of flaming hot Cheetos, which I thought was strangely relevant. Are you smiling because you know this, or are you smiling because this has come out of left field? So...
I'm smiling because I've known you for about a month in researching this and getting it off the ground, and that is a very Jude thing to have watched.
All right. So yeah, this is kind of my thing, is that people often pay a lot of lip service to say, oh, innovation can come from anywhere, but actually quite often the real test is, do you listen at all levels of the company, at all different divisions? And so to give a very quick summary of the flaming hot Cheetos, background, it was basically saying, in the Frito-Lay factory, which I believe the CEO was Italian, but the plant, for obvious cost reasons, was outputting and producing the product in Mexico. And it took them 10 years to realize that they had this incredibly dedicated, passionate engineer. Sorry, I shouldn't say engineer. He was previously the guy just mopping the floors. And then he'd been working with the engineers. And at one point, the company was looking like it was going to go under. And he said, you're not selling anything to this incredible local market of people who are Mexican. And we want it spicy. We want it flaming hot. And so, long story short, spoiler alert, it's one of the reasons the company managed to save itself, is because they realized there was this incredible cultural blind spot that was quite literally in front of them. They were busy producing a product that was all like ranch flavor for Middle America, completely ignoring that they could be selling literally 100 meters outside the factory, by the truckload. And so I feel like, that for me feels to encapsulate a lot of why diversity matters. Like, yes, there's all the sort of righteous, virtuous things, but if that isn't enough of a reason for you, it's the business as well. you know.
And Nicole, what's the reality of neurodiversity inclusion in Australia at the moment? What struggles do they have? Is there a good take up? And you were saying earlier that there's a government initiative as well. What's the landscape?
The reality is that across Australia, and is exactly the same in the UK, there is more people in employment in Australia who are neurodivergent than anybody realizes. If we go back to stats show us that globally it's believed to be 20% of the world's population. However, when I'm working inside organizations, and we've got to also be very, very clear, organizations who have a clearer understanding, a lot of this is just anecdotal because they're not collecting and asking the right questions. And disclosure is still a very tricky conversation for a lot of individuals at workplaces. They don't feel psychologically safe to disclose. But I'm working in organizations where it's 30%, 45% in a legal firm that I've recently been working in. So when you start thinking of those numbers, we're not talking about edge cases here. We're talking about within organizations, cognitive diversity is embedded already there. The trouble is that we're not actually tapping into that. We're not realizing the entrepreneurship, the different ways of thinking, the analytical approaches, and capitalizing on a lot of those skills. And where we need to be moving is looking at those skill sets and role shaping or role scraping to really start utilizing. What I sometimes refer to within organizations is individuals, and Jude just talked about this incredible man who made these suggestions, and he wasn't working at that time as an engineer. Fantastic that they listened to him, but that is a classic case of underemployment. And we see this in Australia all the time. Individuals who have unique skill sets and ways of working, but the organisation they're in is either not capitalising on their skills, and so they're being underemployed, or they're in roles that are not actually married well to their strong skill set.
So, Jude, can you relate to that? What was your sort of career trajectory like? Did you have an easy start, or
I don't know how much homework you've done, but obviously anyone who has a look at my CV, it's very messy. I basically found school quite difficult, and I sort of remember not to get the violins out. I didn't have a life of hard knocks, but certainly sort of didn't feel I sort of fitted in, and was sort of often derided as not being very, very clever or academic, which ostensibly ends up meaning the same thing. I was late diagnosed at age 25 with dyslexia. And as much as I think, some people might cynically say, oh, well, great, you get a laptop and a little bit extra time in exams. The most helpful thing was really the psychologist not just validating it, but actually they took pains to say, don't use it as a crutch, use it as a way to better understand how to get the best out of your neurodiversity and how you just see the world differently. So it was a sort of sigh of relief that I wasn't defective, but actually it was a way of me, really trying to lean in more to just saying I'm a visual thinker. I'm someone who just literally sees and does things differently, and I need to make more of a virtue of that in my work and also my personal interactions. My then girlfriend, now wife, I'm happy to say. I think even just being self-aware of what our limitations is sort of good to avoid appearing callous or insensitive to someone else, and you just go, I will forget the shopping if I don't write it down, let me write it down. That those things can really sometimes make sure that you're seen with the best of intentions without it being something that's seen as troublemaking or negative. So I think when you apply that back to the state of the workforce, it's just that thing of how can we get people to just feel more confident in themselves if they have a neurodiversity, but also that other people don't feel that they have to fix them, that it's just having an awareness of certain, I think the word is affordances. Nicole will tell me if it's a different thing, but I think that affordances feels like a soft word. It's not asking the world to bend to the will of someone who's dyslexic. It's just saying, if you could meet us in the middle, that would be appreciated, and we'll probably get to some exciting places as a result. So I would say with my career, that's really been the sort of thing that I've noticed steadily is I get better by having more faith and more confidence in myself, but also being upfront with people as well. So I think it's a blessing to have that knowledge in order to succeed as an individual, but as part of a team as well.
And I think everyone can relate to that everyone's got shortcomings. Everyone's got something that they forget the shopping, or their car's really messy, or whatever. But there's this brilliant thing that they do as well. So if you can forgive this and avoid the shame of that person feeling shameful about it.
I think what really helps is when you shape it from that strengths-based perspective. Jude has spoken around having a diagnosis in his 20s. Here in Australia, the vast majority of individuals that come to me for coaching are women in their 30s and 40s with a late diagnosis. And that is obviously because diagnostic measures and understanding of female presentation has greatly changed. But what we're also seeing is people who have had a long history of feeling like they are not good enough, they've not coped, quite often having a wrongful diagnosis, things like OCD and eating disorders, anxiety, depression, all symptoms of the challenges they've faced as a result of undiagnosis of particularly what we tend to see, ADHD and autism. And what happens is once we get that diagnosis, that's brilliant because you have that aha moment and people feel a sense of relief and, oh, that explains everything. There is also, of course, that feeling of, if only I'd known. That makes so much sense. I wish I had have known that. That would have helped me with the decisions that I made earlier in life. But we're not given a manual. Once that diagnosis comes through, nobody says this is now what it needs to look like for you. And it is greatly different for everybody. But once we start exploring self and we can say, I know that I am really good at X, Y, and Z, but if somebody does this to help me, it means I'm going to find it much easier. So it may be the example of, I know that I am a really big picture thinker, come up with some really creative ideas. I'm willing to put all of that together in a presentation, but then the details that come to actually making that first step of getting to the process of development, that's where I need a team behind me to help. So you're able to articulate. It may be, I know that I am really, really productive and get a lot of work done. But if I can have flexibility to work from home a couple of days a week where I don't have constant distractions, I'm going to be much better at what I do. It's that understanding self and feeling better about yourself that's going to make a huge difference. I always go back to the quote that Hannah Gadsby said when they did their fabulous stand-up Douglas, and they said, it was like being handed the keys to the city. It was like being handed the keys to myself. So that idea of diagnosis, it was unlocking who I am as an individual. And we need to understand that this is just not brain diversity. It is the whole nervous system, and understanding self makes a huge change with the way we look at the way we operate in everyday life, but of course in the workplace.
So then transferring that to the leadership of people who are neurodiverse, how does that message get across, either pre-diagnosis or post-diagnosis? Because the individual is having their own realization, understanding of themselves. How does someone who's in charge, or the coach or the manager, to also understand their benefits and limitations?
Well, first of all, you need to provide an environment where someone feels psychologically safe to disclose in the first place. Unfortunately, what we see is so often disclosure comes at a point where things have got quite terrible in an employment situation, or where somebody is being performance managed and then they talk. I had a situation the other day where someone disclosed to a manager, and it was only after quite a traumatic situation that had happened at work in a busy hospital setting. So it tends to be that there's a trigger. That's not best case scenario. Best case scenario is that people feel confident to talk about their specific needs, either at diagnosis when they feel comfortable, that they have a manager that's willing to engage and listen. And I'm happy to go sort of through some of the best case scenarios if someone does disclose, but I just am also very conscious of time. But it's also around, and I'm sorry, I changed my thought pattern then, so I've lost my thought. Sorry, everybody. First thing in the morning, I really clearly need another coffee. But what I was saying, sorry, remind me, everybody, I was talking about disclosure and feeling safe to disclose, and we were
Yeah.
talking about managers, weren't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we don't actually even need a disclosure to be able to support people. What we actually need as a leader is, if you know that somebody may need a management style that's not actually working right now, you're not seeing that they're thriving, their productivity might be low, maybe their well-being isn't great. As a leader and as a manager, be inquisitive. At no time do you have to say, are you neurodivergent? Or have you ever considered? The questions you start asking is around work style preferences. How best do you work in the office? Tell me, like, what environment is going to work for you? Where do you find that you're most productive? Talk about communication. When we're communicating, how's the best way that I actually engage with you? Do you like feedback to be regular and face to face? Is it that it would be better for me to give you feedback via email, in writing? Talk about the way someone feels motivated at work. Ask them what's the most satisfying parts of their role. How do they like to learn? If they're learning a new skill, is it that they like to be mirroring with someone else, or they like a manual and just to be left on their own devices? Are you somebody who really appreciates that check in to help you along the way when you're working through a program? Or do you need me to just step back? If we start asking all these questions, at no time there have I talked anything about a label. What I've done is just try to understand that person. And if we do that, then we're building up an understanding. And it's leaders that ask those questions and are curious and admit they might get it wrong, but I want to partner with you to make your work life as easy as possible. They're the ones that are going to make people feel safe to disclose anyway. So you're sort of opening up that door just by showing and leaning in and understanding that when we're working with people, we want to be able to make the most of the way they work. But we also want to use those principles of universal design. If we know that everybody would benefit from having a very clear meeting agenda, but it's essential for some people to understand context and understand that they feel prepared and reduce anxiety. It's not that it's not something that's going to help everybody. Everybody will appreciate understanding what that meeting and the points that we're going to go through, but we're helping others in a way that is absolutely essential for them to be their best self at work.
And Jude, what do you know about universal design? You must have experience in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I feel, strangely, there's a book actually called I think it was like 100 Principles of Universal Design, which was around at the time I was a student, and I think it's still in print and still considered a sort of a good way of acting as a primer to basically just train a muscle in your brain, as it were, that you appreciate that the way you see the world isn't the way everyone else sees the world, and things that give you satisfaction or pleasure or you find easy aren't necessarily the case for someone else. I mean, there's very basic things in the book of saying things like, well, had you considered, I think it's like, 10% of, the male population is colorblind, in which case it's actually kind of interesting when you look at the gaming industry, which has very high proportions, of course, of male players, and in terms of a volume of market, and yet it isn't always shouted about that you can go into the settings and switch on something that will basically help with that condition. So I won't name names, but I actually know one of the engineers who basically sort of started that revolution in computer games, who I met through Lego. And, he said it's extraordinary when you looked at the numbers of people who would be affected, and all we really needed to do is just change a little preset, and it was going to affect quite literally millions of customers a year, who weren't necessarily going to write in and complain, but it's because they weren't even aware that it was something that was realistic to complain about and demand. And so I think that's also one of the interesting, tricky things. And I guess if it seems apparent to the audience that I'm trying to always look for the business case, it's perhaps because I feel that maybe I sound very jaded and long in the tooth, but I would say it's the same with sustainability. I've just done a big project with Nvidia and a large electronics distributor looking at packaging, and we've tried to make it about, packaging, people, planet. But I also think the whole reason it's got traction is because it's saving a lot of money. And I think the argument I feel is, with neurodiversity, and I've given presentations to literally people who are day traders, a room full of about 150 day traders in a big London firm. And it wasn't trying to tell them that they need to be more touchy-feely. It was showing them that basically it seems insane that you're not looking at basically the growing market of women being more financially astute, more decoupled from traditional values of having to be a stay-at-home mum. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's just saying that that basically converts to business. And so I think the most traction I've seen in discussing neurodiversity in companies is really where people realize yes, there's a virtuous benefit, but also their work just gets so much more exciting. I think and I guess I'd be interested to know both of your opinions on this, but I feel the sticking point is that if you've got someone at the top, and culture obviously often does cascade down from the CEO and the leadership team, but
Definitely.
if they're not people who are really excited about travel, reading, watching, engaging with very different things on a regular basis, um, I kind of feel sometimes that's one of the things that is quite difficult to inculcate in a company culture if it isn't essentially legitimized to say, well, the reason we're buying these books or the reason we're going traveling to this place is because we need essentially a new perspective on the problems we're trying to solve. So I think I don't want to sort of take us in a direction that wasn't on the agenda, but I feel that's sort of almost the most compelling argument I feel for companies is to try and show the business case that it just makes a lot of sense to have that. And I'm clearly plagiarizing from Nassim Taleb's Black Swan and the sort of concepts around antifragile here, which for any readers who aren't familiar with is basically just saying, if you keep doing the same thing, you will not spot the headwind that will knock you off course as a business. So the more diversity of thought, creativity, culture, experience, that's going to build resilience, or as he puts it, anti-fragile capability.
Just to, I wrote an article on my LinkedIn last week about Fulton Reed from the Mighty Ducks. So Mighty Ducks is a hockey movie from the early 90s, and they're a struggling team. And the coach finds a kid who can hit a ball really hard. He can't skate. He's never skated before. He's never been on a hockey team. He would have been excluded from any kind of usual hiring process. But he was actually the person. Without him, they wouldn't have got to the playoffs. They wouldn't have got to the championship. They wouldn't have won the championship. So just to sort of highlight in another left field way of that, the power of diversity and trying something different and going outside the box.
I would totally add another one to that of Shaolin, if I could say it, Shaolin soccer
Yeah.
is another great one from Hong Kong, which is exactly, I think it's one of those things where quite often in the West we have very much a fixation around the hero's journey, and I quite like that actually when people actually fragment that into multiple capabilities, because it actually gets a little bit more exciting to watch rather than just a singular hero. It becomes a team collective with very different traits. So I guess maybe that might be an interesting thing to reflect on, is not necessarily a stone cold east west division, but I do think it's quite interesting how Asia does seem to sort of enjoy
Mm.
that trope in movie making of the team win of a motley crew. And I think quite
Yeah.
often when you look at sort of Disney and they've actually been borrowing from some of these, you know, templates, which are actually, as you'd expect from China, pretty old. So,
And how does that translate, Nicole, like to is it it's not an easy feat, you know, especially recruitment, like, you know, there are established channels in recruitment and uh there's very clearly you do need to put in the the attributes that you need, the tasks that they're going to complete, and have that kind of clarity.
Mm.
So is there a way to be diversity inclusive in that application process? How's that look?
Well, I think that, first of all, I mean, I completely agree with what Jude was saying. Inclusive cultures don't just tolerate difference. What they do is they actively design for it. They want to protect it. They want to be able to capitalize on that. I think that there is a huge challenge with AI and recruitment, and how we can potentially be locking people out. Um, I always say best practice is that we ask the direct questions when it comes to recruitment. Not everybody's going to disclose, but if you can have in an application a statement around, if you require adjustments to the recruitment process, please contact with an email address. That just allows people to be upfront straight away. So if you're wanting to capitalize on that, actually saying that, we encourage diversity and people to apply. So we're showing right from the onset that we want that. If you, through a recruitment process, could change just one aspect of being inclusive, neuro-inclusive, it would be that through the interview process, you first of all, before even getting to interview, allow people to demonstrate skill set instead of having to articulate it. So giving them some sort of piece of work where they need to demonstrate that's applicable for the role that they're going in. I've seen people who've been going for roles and needed to know coding languages that they don't know, but being extremely competent, capable learners have learnt a language over a weekend and got the role. So give people the opportunity to really demonstrate that. And we see that with a lot of neurodivergent individuals. But once they've got to that interview process, the thing that we need to lean into, and we're seeing here in Australia, is greatly improving. And Jude, I don't know if you've come across this in the UK yet, but that notion of providing interview questions in writing beforehand. So that could be half an hour beforehand, it could be the day before. But what it allows people to do is to read the question, and they're not relying solely, when they're in a very high stress situation of having an interview, to have to use their auditory processing to listen to that question, to absorb it, process and use their working memory, and then give a really articulate response. So even having those written questions will help everybody. Again, we're going back to universal design. This is not about doing something that is going to give somebody a leg up. It's about, when we're going through a recruitment process, we want to truly understand who's going to be the best fit for the role. So give them the scaffolding to be able to demonstrate who they are, so you can capitalize and find these people.
And then and then you talk about psychological safety when you get into the workplace. And Jude, you talk about prototyping and that sort of need to fail. So I'd love to have a conversation about creating psychological safety that allows failure. And I guess it's kind of meta in this discussion, because if we're implementing our own practices in our businesses, in our roles, in our departments where we can be inclusive, then there's an allowance for ourselves to fail in that as well, as we're sort of implementing these systems. So, Nicole, do you want to start off talking a little bit about the psychological safety in terms of neuro-inclusion?
Sure. In Australia, we have got new legislation that supports the fact that every employee needs to feel psychologically safe in their workplace. It's not just about physical safety. And that is extremely important. We're having organisations lean into that, because the realisation is that how we make a neurodivergent individual feel psychologically safe in the workplace is going to look very different sometimes to other people. Whether somebody communicates differently. Now, we know that a lot of neurodivergent individuals are quite literal. They can be quite direct. Maybe their tone doesn't necessarily match with the way that society would deem as a terrible, I'm sorry to say, normal. But the fact is that when somebody communicates, allowing them to be their authentic self, not have to mask, and that we assume good intention. We assume that when somebody is communicating, they're doing it to be direct, to be helpful, because they want to see innovation, that they're critiquing and want to move on, that they're those individuals that do want to see innovation and that progress. So that direct communication and calling things out sometimes can be misunderstood, and people then get labelled as being the problem, or being too rude, or they ask too many questions, or if somebody's asking for clarity, they're questioning authority. That is not what psychologically safe environments look like. People need to be able to communicate in the ways that's going to be safe for them, communicate in any adjustments that they may need, understand that working from home and having flexibility is not just seen as something that is a privilege, but actually it is an innate part of being able to do their role productively if that's what they need. And the list could go on, but I think one of the most important aspects linking back to the conversations about managers is for managers to demonstrate that they want to lean in, they want to be curious, they want to embrace unique ways of working and thinking. That builds psychological safety across organisations.
And then, but then just to sort of be contrarian for a moment, what if there is somebody who is hindering progress by asking too many questions and standing in the way of something that they don't believe in, but that has been signed off by everybody else? What's the balance of that to keep the ship moving, but
absolutely, and
make sure everyone's heard?
I think that the thing there is looking at the way we interpret what's happening and what is the intention of the person. If we look at those two and that counterbalance. So if somebody is asking questions or they're concerned, I always like to say, let's look at the function of the behaviour. So instead of thinking that person is asking too many questions and they're being disruptive, maybe the conversation is, I've noticed that you've got concerns or there's something going on, you're asking these questions. Do you want to let me know what is troubling you? So just asking. And that, instead of trying to just palm these questions off, which creates more anxiety, we're leaning in and we're just trying to understand perspective. Change can be really hard for a lot of neurodivergent individuals. Some love it. That dopamine hit comes from constant innovation and change, and that's brilliant. A lot of neurodivergent individuals, particularly autistic individuals, like structure, routine, and not necessarily too au fait with change. But they absolutely will embrace it if they understand that there is clear rationale and purpose.
Yeah.
But what we do in organisations so often is we just make systems changes and we don't consult, we don't explain. If we actually were just able, if you saw somebody who's being problematic, labelled as problematic or a bit of a blocker, if the manager had a conversation and said, I understand your thinking around this, let me explain our thinking and explain that, it changes the conversation completely.
Yeah. And then there could be issues also with articulation, even in that conversation. Maybe there is a problem that someone can't, they haven't got past it far enough to understand themselves what's truly going on. So they might be, well, what's your problem? Why are you standing in the way of progress?
Yeah.
I mean, even, maybe that's the reason.
But I
why
probably
you
wouldn't
can't
ask.
articulate.
I wouldn't ask that question, because what that is labeling and saying the person's standing in the way of progress, and they're
Yeah.
not a problem. The question is, I've noticed you have some concerns about the way we're progressing.
Yeah.
Let's have a conversation about that. Do you want to let me know? And that might be that it's, you don't have to articulate that right now. Absolutely. Go away, have a think about it. And how about we have a conversation about it? Because I want you to be on board, but I also want to hear your thoughts. I want us to be able to progress. But labeling and saying somebody is blocking or being difficult is not going to get you anywhere. It's actually the opposite. You're creating a challenge for them to feel safe, to be able to talk about their concerns.
And do you work often with people for projects that are highly innovative, with different people with different backgrounds? What's sort of your experience of like high flow states and how you're communicating with each other when you're really, really productive and everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, I guess I sort of feel that I think we sort of talked about this in the meeting before, but I guess I'm sort of anxious not to sort of get cancelled for putting the wrong words here in the wrong order. But as you said, Nicole, with the best of intentions, there's I think explaining that I'm neurodiverse and have come from these backgrounds, I hope it would be taken that way. But I think when I got my first opportunity to be a manager at Sugru, I was really proud of the fact that the team went from just 2 people to 12 in about 2.5 years. We had basically a 50-50 split in terms of gender, but it the diversity was extremely broad, not just in terms of skin color, but it was cultural perspective that people brought. People had different religions, even down to something which might seem as tangential as dietary requirements. And so weirdly, even that last point meant that the tradition in the company had been on a Friday we go to the pub, but we had people who didn't drink because of their religion. And that made us think, okay, well, what else could we do that would be more interesting? So we started, we did things like we went bowling and we went to sort of late night museum things. We saw cinema shows. We saw all sorts of different things. We took trips. And so I think sometimes that is the growing pains of companies is realizing how do you not just pay lip service to sort of diversity, but actually sort of really try and make a virtue of it. That if you say, okay, so we're not allowed to have beer, and people will be like, oh, that sounds good. But if you replace it with something which actually is more interesting and more stimulating, because I can tell you, there's plenty of people when you get them aside and you realize they're going through the motions because it's just peer pressure that they go to the pub on Friday. Whereas we took it in turns to say each person would be in charge of organizing that Friday's entertainment. And so it meant that it really rotated. But I would say the more leadership thing, I think I would want to air to my earlier anxiety of just wanting to sort of sidle round to it, is that I would deliberately pair people together who I thought would be an incredible team, but I was aware that sparks were going to fly. So I'm obviously not going to name names, but there was one person who had really risen up through the ranks of being an immigrant, working in the production line, frankly, the classic story of being overqualified and not fully appreciated or realized, but had been promoted up and risen through the ranks. And then there was someone who had at the same level who had basically come in from a much more comfortable background, which I'm sure they wouldn't mind me saying, just to call it what it is, more privileged. And in all honesty, there was tension when they first worked together. And I think that's one of the things I wonder sometimes with the DEI, sort of the virtues is that we sometimes make out as if this path is going to be easy and painless just because it's virtuous and right. But the simple thing is, I had to take, and I did this with all of the team, is that I would rotate having lunch with them on a one-to-one basis, and I would rotate so that every week I'd be seeing someone. And that was my opportunity to basically allow people to air grievances, recalibrate, and as you were saying, Nicole, actually feel heard, that they say, I'm not trying to be a blocker, but I'm really irritated by this person's behavior. And it would allow me to have that side of everybody's story. And then I'd say, just to, I hope I'm not over talking here, but the other thing that we did, which I think was very useful, is every month we would write down on one side of A4 what things we were enjoying, what things were difficult, what things we needed the team to help us with, and what things we thought the company was maybe developing a blind spot. And we would sit for 2 hours and basically go through all of the teething problems. And there was a mentality that we said, imagine we weren't keeping score literally on a whiteboard, but we said you get 1 point if you raise a problem, you get 3 points if you figure out how to solve it. And that's the way I kind of feel almost neurodiversity should be viewed. Is like, it's to your point, Nicole. It's like 1 point if you've correctly labeled someone, but it's 3 points if the label is irrelevant and you've just found out how to get the best out of them in the team. And so I think, just to conclude, I feel what managers at senior levels need most is almost the grace period to say they are gonna, I won't swear, but they're gonna make a lot of mistakes. It's gonna be worse before it gets better, because they're gonna put the foot in it. And if we assume the logic of neurodiversity, you cannot assume that the person who is amazing at running a company and leading people might also be terrible at understanding all of these extremely complex
Absolutely.
behaviors. So therein is a dichotomy which needs, as you said, best of intentions and benefit of the doubt,
Yeah.
that they too are going on a journey, and it's going to get messy.
But as long as you lean in, and I think that what you're
Exactly.
saying, what you're describing there is building adaptive humans in
Yeah.
your organization. Being adaptive, it doesn't matter if you have all the most technology, if you don't have a culture that is adaptive, it's just not going to work. And I think the difference there is what you're saying is that culture is built on the everyday decisions. And you're going to make some decisions that don't work, but you're also going to be making a lot of decisions down the track that do work. And it's not just about policies or statements of intention, it's about the practice and actually embedding it. And your example of just having those weekly check-ins with everybody is exactly what builds that culture. And I think that, all the examples you've given are around alternate ways of interacting are exactly what is needed. Throughout the years, I know at Exceptional Academy, we've done very similar things. We've had Friday pizza and gaming lunchtimes. We have had escape room activities instead of that traditional Christmas party. I recently was working with an organisation, and I saw that they were having a big team dinner, but were very conscious that where that dinner was taking place, and it wasn't in a really loud restaurant, they had their own sort of private dining area. They told those where their social battery, they know they need a little bit more time to work from home that day to then come in. But what I think was just brilliant about what they did was they did have alcohol at this event, but in the middle of the table, they had wooden puzzle boxes, and the only way to get in to this puzzle box, which had the bottles of wine in it, was that it was a problem to open these puzzle boxes. And let me tell you, it was the neurodivergent staff members who got them open. Nobody would have been drinking a glass of wine that night without that. But what that actually did was, for those who found that environment a little bit tricky, it gave them something to do. It gave them it was something to concentrate on. It eased them in. It also was a cognitive and physical activity that generated social interaction without having to have that small talk. So there is a lot of ways we can think about building this inclusive culture without, as you say, going to the pub.
This sounds wonderful, because it sounds like we're almost going to conclude on we're just humanizing people. We're just seeing the person behind the role and who they are, what their preferences are, finding out the problems before somebody's been dealing with a problem by themselves for months and it's got to a really critical and difficult situation. So I think that's wonderful, especially in terms of trying not to label. Labels can give us understanding, maybe sometimes, of where that is. Do you think, Nicole, or
I think sometimes it helps people with context. So if I am working with somebody and they have told me right from the get-go, say that they are autistic, I am not necessarily going to make assumptions about the way they work, but it can give me some context to say, okay, so tell me a little bit then about what your preferences are. Are you somebody who, and I can start making some suggestions as well. That's another thing that's really important. Just remembering that when we lean in and ask people questions, they don't always have the solutions themselves, particularly newly diagnosed individuals. So, when we ask how best, can we work with you, or what adjustments do you need, so often people don't actually know. So for me, as somebody who feels very confident in this space, having somebody tell me they're autistic, I can potentially say, okay, great. So I'm guessing you might benefit if I do this. And that's not me saying I'm going to do that. I'm guessing, I'm telling you that, and they may say, actually, no, that doesn't work for me. I prefer it this way. But what it is I'm leaning in and I'm asking questions.
Talking of questions, if anybody does want to pop a question into the chat, there is a button at the bottom of your screen to put in questions. Jude, any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess I sort of feel that this thing about representation is something that interests me a lot. I'm guessing you've probably seen the documentary Coded Bias, or if not, you'll know of the general principles of, as the title of this talk of, the age of AI. I think it's something that concerns me a lot in my work, of how we're in a situation where if we use the default web at the minute, the default web carries with it automatic bias. And that's not me being sort of, woke or liberal about it. That's just simply factually borne out by the data and the way these systems are architected. And so I think it gets quite interesting to think, how can organizations not just say, oh, well, it's okay, we got this report from here, or we typed in this thing and we got this result back. It's recognizing whether that has an inherent bias towards a particular group of people. It's obviously an easy reach to say that can tend to cater towards white men, but I also think there's other things in there that can also be narrowing for a company's perspective. So I guess it's not really I wouldn't say it's a statement. It's almost an open question that I think is a a developing narrative at the minute in a lot of companies of if we want to use more AI tools, if we want to um, incorporate these things into our processes, it is almost like bringing a I haven't premeditated this, but it is almost like bringing a new neurotype into an
Mm.
organization and recognizing it's not automatically evil, but it might have limitations and flaws that you need to sort of counter for in order to harmonize in the workforce. I think where it differs obviously from a human is that with an individual and a human you can have an intelligent discussion, whereas you can't just have a discussion with your AI service provider because this is, you know, a multi-billion pound tech company you're usually dealing with. So I think what is interesting, and the reason I wanted to raise that point is, oddly enough, I think the better we are at managing humans, the less difficult it will appear to understand bias within our AI
Mm.
systems, because we've got more of that, as I said early on in the competition, to the conversation, we've got more of that muscle trained in understanding how to adjust without it feeling like, you know, we're bending over backwards and, you know, we're feeling distracted by something trivial. It's that this actually just makes total sense in terms of business operations and resilience.
So I do have a question.
Oh,
How do
good.
organizations who are waking up to neurodiversity inclusion start the process of creating an environment that discovers the hidden talents and needs within their existing workforce? What methods work best?
It's a really great question. I think that is a capacity building issue. I think that leaders need to have the training to be able to understand how they can capitalize on that. So, what are the strengths that you're going to see within different individuals? And then that then again leads into having a greater understanding of where people are really thriving, what parts of their role are they really thriving, and if we're looking at the life cycle of an employee, how we can funnel them into being able to really project themselves into those strong areas that they're going to succeed. Exceptional Academy does have an assessment tool, and we look at raw skill set, which is something that people can use to understand, and it looks at things like logical and numerical reasoning. It looks at problem solving. It looks at pattern recognition and attention to detail, and that is a really useful tool if organisations don't really know where to start. We're also seeing young recruits and organisations sort of capitalising on that to get a greater understanding. But, you know, whenever over the years I start a conversation with, tell me about your strengths, tell me what you're really good at, most people know. So, as just a first start, asking the questions, leaning in, being curious. I know that has been sort of a lot of the answers today, but it's true. Stop making assumptions and start talking to your people.
Maybe build that into your your quarterly one-on-ones, or like Jude, have that weekly
Yeah,
one-on-one.
I think maybe a quick add to that is just, I think sometimes, and you know, I do a lot of this work in terms of business consulting and business speaking, and what interests me about it is that sometimes I think, you know, we spent a lot of time talking today as sort of the main thrust of business, but I think there's also huge merit in sometimes doing sort of side projects,
Mm.
because it's not because I see them or I pitch them to companies as a distraction. It's that sometimes it's the same validity in that you have a hobby, in that you
Yeah.
need sometimes a safe space to do something which hasn't got all the pressures of revenues and KPIs and performance and all these sorts of things, but it allows teams to self-organize and develop around an agenda. So even at Dyson, we used to have challenges which were open to all the company to do usually a sort of wacky challenge to solve a problem. But also, even in terms of business, we tried to, I ended up launching something called Open Ideas Day, which basically meant every month you're allowed to work on a project for a day that you felt would be disruptive and useful to the company, but you could self-direct it. So you could come at any tangent you want as long as you could put in a compelling case. Now, weirdly, circling back to where I started with the Cheetos Flaming Hot, it meant that you could literally be the least experienced engineer in the company, but every month you would have an audience with the C-suite. And that for me is a really exciting way to explore, as which is what I keep coming back to. Diversity for me is an opportunity. How
Mm.
do you get something where you go, wow, we'd never thought of that? And to the point that Nicole has been expressing much better than I could, but this point about saying one person can't always do everything. So it's that Shaolin soccer, it's that forgot the movie you
Mighty
mentioned,
Ducks. Yeah,
Mighty
yeah.
Ducks. It's that principle that someone might be a great starter, but you need the team to help finish it.
Mm. Love it. And can I just say on that, side projects, 100%.
I love
And
that. Yeah.
I absolutely see that in organizations is just a brilliant strategy. What that gives an individual, particularly if they're an ADHDer, is it gives them that dopamine hit that they need. It keeps them engaged. And so there's a lot of brain science around working in that sort of structure as well. So it's definitely a way to lean in.
And possibly like, reflecting on some of my own mistakes and listening to Jude and yourself, Nicole, listening to what those side projects are. Sometimes I project my own side projects on other people. So again, there's de-heroing yourself. Everyone's a hero on the team.
I think so, and I think also maybe just a small elaboration that I've put the emphasis there on the internal, but what I've also been doing with companies like Nvidia and RS over the years has also been saying how do you prototype in real life, and what I mean by that is outside of the company. So how can
Mm.
you also put an idea out there, which I think in the early days of open source, people just thought, oh, you're just giving ideas away. Why would you do that? Why would you release something before it's fully formed? And of course, there's times when it doesn't make sense. But there's times where you go half of this project, and this is where I've done a few TED Talks on dealing with creativity and uncertainty, is that it gets quite interesting when you say part of this project will reveal itself when it is actually out there in the community being used. And I'm not going to wax lyrical about it because I'm conscious of time. But if you look at, one of the projects which I was, privy to and is absolutely extraordinary, which is Lego's Smart Play and Smart Bricks, basically bricks with fiendishly clever miniature electronics inside them, do all sorts of interesting play experiences. A few people on social media I noticed are sort of saying, well, is it just lights and is it just sounds? What does it all mean? And the point is, they're prototyping out there in the real world. It's gonna evolve year
Mm.
on year and year. And I think, weirdly, I'm not trying to shoehorn everything into sort of it's all about neurodiversity, but there's something very exciting about realizing for even a company as big and as prestigious and as capable as Lego to have that humility to say, we're still going to allow everyone else in the world to help make this a success. That's not that's not a lack of confidence. It's quite the opposite.
I think I am conscious of time. Thank you, everybody, for holding on. I think we could talk for another hour on this topic quite easily. And something that we talked in the pre-talk is about the spectrum of neurodiversity. We do appreciate that there are some people who have, for them, the neurodiversity is a severe disability, and but that doesn't disclude their inherent value. There's often still something about them, whether they're creative or they're experimental or they're doing something in their own life that would have immense value if they were to be accepted into the sort of broader community and how we all work together. But it's just looking at the possibilities of how we approach that kind of inclusivity by just sort of prototyping in our own little bubbles. I've made some notes of like universal design and expanding your experience. Everyone is a hero. Having an adaptive culture. I loved all of those things. So I think I will just go to both of you, Jude and Nicole, for just anything that you found a really good point that came out of this conversation that you're going to take back into your lives. So, Jude, we'll go first with you.
Sure. I guess maybe just ever so quickly to build on that point, that I think companies sometimes worry about, well, why are we doing something for a minority if it's about trying to make business from the majority of a bigger market? And I think it's that weird thing that working with BBC Big Life Fix, which, dare I say, there's a bootleg on YouTube if anyone's interested, but basically we're working with people with different disabilities. But I think the show really made a case for the fact that by spending time empathizing and understanding people who are maybe been marginalized, actually it isn't a guarantee that you will automatically turn that into a mass market product. That's not the goal. But it's that belief that it will create a domino effect, that one thing leads to another. And the case I often use when describing to students is that you take for granted that you can send a text message on your phone with one hand. But actually, when you look at the early days of those devices like BlackBerry, you had a keyboard and you needed to use both thumbs. Now, that doesn't sound like a disability, but actually, if you're carrying a baby or a bag of shopping, or maybe you have got only one arm that you can use, then suddenly one-handed typing is a game changer. And I think companies sometimes forget that, well, how do you get that incredible insight? You get that insight by looking at the fringes. And so I think that is why you keep hearing comedians, artists, poets, agitators, provocateurs. We look back at them in history and go, hey, they're onto something. And you go, it's because they're operating at the fringes, and that takes a bit of courage. And so I think, again, to sort of, ram home the point, so I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted with this audience, but I think for me, that is the real motivator, is that selfishly, I just have more fun working in diverse teams. And so I think that is honestly the truth. It's the reason I love working with different companies, is that moment when their team realizes there's something they hadn't realized is a game changer.
And Nicole?
Oh, I think that Jude has just, summed it up so well. But I think that I'll sort of just go back to that original point, that of course we do this because as a society we want to look after every one of our valuable citizens. We want people to be the best that they can be and to thrive. But I'll just go back to the fact that this is not that there is a fringe outliers. It's that we don't actually understand how many people are already in organisations. So we have so many already there. Let's capitalize on them. Let's actually be curious. And more importantly, let's make people feel psychologically safe at work by leaning more into this.
Beautiful. That's such a beautiful ending. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your time. We're going to send through an email to everyone who registered with the recording, and just a few notes on Jude's work and on Nicole's work and some resources. So thank you so much. If you have any other comments, please feel free to get in touch, and have a great morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.